us, but they can also tell us what's right as well. And so sometimes we have to invest in asking the right questions and, I'm one of those people who advocate taking some of those self-assessment tests like strength finders. Find out what it is you are excellent at doing, right? And focus on that because that gives you your greatest advantage. Learn how to exploit that, learn how to cultivate that, right? I don't think we do enough of that. So strength finders is good. How to fascinate is another good self-test. And so make some investments that they don't cost a lot and spend some time understanding what it is that you bring, that special talent that gives you an advantage. So that's my second piece of advice. I would also say that we need to give ourselves permission to change our careers. Most of STEM advocates, like the folks that you see on the phone, all of us on this webcast, we have invested years in STEM education, and making sure that we started at an early age in science, in math, etc. But there are also other STEM careers that you could step into if you're mid-career to help solve, for example, the cyber challenge. There are many opportunities to get certifications, to go to different universities, to understand, to be tutored, etc. So it's not too late. There is an article that I would recommend folks reading. It's easy to find. It's called "Is It Too Late to Start a Career in STEM?" You can Google it, and Heather Stone is the author. I think that can provide you some sort of resources and sort of a perspective on what it would look like to change your career at this point.
Dr. Delavo, I think that is really sound advice. I think, so many people think that they are stuck into a track. And, you get stuck into a certain track. This is going to be my life. And I think, particularly when I look at cybersecurity, and as I mentioned, I used to run a cybersecurity company, and there's just no women in cybersecurity, and there needs to be, badly there needs to be. And I think, so many women solve problems every day. We're solving challenges all the time around the kids, the family, the home, the juggling of work and everything else. And I bet there is a lot of women who would be extremely capable in cybersecurity who just don't think they can get there. And it reminds me almost of those old posters that we had during, I think, World War II, your country, Uncle Sam needs you, or your country needs you. We kind of need you now. We need you now in STEM. And I think particularly we need you in cybersecurity. It's, of critical importance to the nation's defense. So I love what your words of wisdom there, particularly around the reskilling, and it's not too late. Dr. Mallett or Sam, do you guys have any other thoughts on this?
I'd like to piggyback on the idea that you have to have the flexibility to change careers. And so for the audience, I was just reflecting as Dr. Delavo was speaking about my aspirations as a young woman were to become a pediatrician. And then when I went to medical school and did my rotation in pediatrics, I found that I hated it. And absolutely. I studied it very hard, so I didn't have to repeat it. I didn't like not being able to talk to my patients, and I didn't want to deal with the parents. And I never for once considered surgery and fell in love with it. And I'm ending my career and just was appointed the president and CEO of a Meharry Medical College Ventures, an entrepreneurial venture, wholly owned subsidiary of Meharry, so that we can engage in for-profit ventures and rapidly transfer intellectual property on that problem-solving tip that you were focused on. So there've been many iterations of me throughout my career, and it's that courage and that reinventing spirit that has really been a key to my advancement and success, and having that courage to take a step out there when you don't actually know what everything's going to be is really essential to growth and to expansion. So I think for the audience, holding on to that and being comfortable with the idea that you don't really know for sure what's going to be at the end of the road, it's going to be something great. And that belief in yourself that whatever it is, it's going, if you're building on your strengths, as Dr. Delavo said, then it's going to work out, is something I'd like to add and parrot, as she mentioned. It's certainly been true in my career.
Well, very good, very good. And Sam, do you have any comments on this?
Yeah, I mean, I really resonate with this point, and beyond, even getting to a point of thinking about career changes, I work with a lot of younger folks, even in the high school or college or university level, saying, what should I study? Do I have to study computer science? So for myself in my journey, I was very into gaming as a young child and learned to code as a young child because of that, but I didn't study it formally in school. I actually started in neuroscience. I was really interested in human behavior. It didn't work for me, so I moved into anthropology, and that was really my lens, where I was studying technology from that perspective, but I also would build things on the side. And so when I built my first company, I got a lot of pushback of, well, you couldn't possibly be a CEO or a CTO or an engineer or a technologist because you didn't study this. So I wouldn't quite call it a career change, but it wasn't even a career beginning in the in quotes, traditional path. And so, when I guess the advice I'd give is, don't be afraid to study something that is some of the softer or social sciences. I think when we're speaking about or thinking about problem solving, which is the first idea as an entrepreneur, is what to build and why to build it. And I think that's been a problem, particularly in technology over the past couple of decades, is we've built a lot of incredible systems and software, but we haven't often stopped to think, do we need this or should we be building it? Is it better for society? Is it better for people or the environment, et cetera? And so I think we need a lot of that critical thinking. We're desperately lacking it in the software industry. So I would, again, say, study the things that appeal to you and excite you and play to your strengths, and bring those skills to any aspect of STEM.
No, I think, Sam, I do think that's a great point. And I think things have changed. When I was coming up myself, it was like, you're going to study chemistry because I can get a job. If, I didn't come from a wealthy background. So number one priority for me to go to college was getting a job. And I still think that is the case for many, many people today, is like, they've got to have the surety of a job. But I do think the world is changing. And, if you look at the college statistics, some of the statistics, if you are entering college and you're from a poorer background, you've got an 11% chance of coming out of there with a degree. So, that's very low considering the costs and the debt that you're going to run up. So I think, not for this session, but there's maybe another session on the whole way that we're looking at really, I think, young people today going to college, coming out with a load of debt and no degree is an absolute nightmare of a way to start your life off. So, I think there's definitely some things changing there, and a lot of colleges and schools are focusing more on the career as opposed to just pure academic. So, Sam, I thought that was really enlightening from you there, and I do think you are a younger generation coming through. I love the combination of anthropology with technology, right? Because we didn't do that in the beginning. It was straight tech, and it was without the human angle. So I think that's a fascinating part. In terms of the human connection, we know that historically women have been routinely left out of biomedical research. A lot of time you'll see publications come out with research statistics, and when you look through, you realize it's just white males. It's been improving in recent years, but we know that less than 30% of the world's scientific researchers are women. And really, I'd like to turn this question over to start to Dr. Mallett. And, can you give comment on your experience over the years in this area and whether you see things improving or getting worse for women's representation in healthcare research, both as subjects and as professionals?
Well, unfortunately, I would have to report that we're in a stagnant position. The percentage of women principal investigators has been stagnant, and in women in leadership roles in academic medicine, those who are principal investigators funded at the highest level from the National Institute of Health, the R01 level, has been stagnant and somewhere between 10 and 16%. And we achieved that early in the 90s, and we exclaim when we get up to 16%. It's women come into academia and often get stuck in the assistant professor rank, and there is definitely a stigma attached to being a woman scientist. There is bias in the grants review process. There is bias in the mentors that you're able to attract, and in the postdoc opportunities that you're able to get in laboratories, which are really key and essential to getting the training opportunities that will help to launch your career. And there is also hostility. So if having had conversations with young women, there can be a toxic environment in labs that will discourage them and have them train their trajectory early in their career, even before they get their first independently funded research grant. And it's such a waste because they've worked so hard to go that far. But when you recount the stories, the environment is toxic. It's sabotage. It's belittling. It's verbal abuse in the laboratory, and so I'm ashamed in this national forum to share that in some of the most highly regarded research institution, and that in and of itself is an issue because in the NIH, the percentage of institutions that are funded is also very narrow. Those research institutions with the highest dollars get the highest dollars. So Stanford, Harvard, Yale, University of Pittsburgh, the high-level research institutions continuously attract the same level of dollars. So you don't get diversity within the funding institutions. They continuously attract the same level of funding, and then they're able to buy the talent, so to speak, and it's a repetitive cycle. So you don't get the diversity of thinking either, or the diversity of talent. And for the first time this year, after this exposure that happened with the murder of George Floyd, the NIH released something called the FIRST Awards to actually attract racial diversity in the sciences. Because if we have 16% of funding, we are in the low single digits, in the 1% and 2% for people of color who are primary investigators. And the historically Black medical schools funding and those institutes, research centers that are predominantly serving underrepresented minorities pale in regards to the level of funding. And so the FIRST Awards are designed to assist institutions in creating a rich and rewarding environment for underrepresented minority investigators and women to succeed and create an inclusive environment to jumpstart the diversity in the biomedical sciences that has been lacking since our national institutes have existed. So there are some institutions that are better than others, but nationally we have been stagnant.
Yeah, that's shocking, isn't it? I do think, and you referred to it, the events of last year. Some of the events, 2020 in many ways was a terrible year with the pandemic, but it also exposed some of the ills of this society that have been there for a long time. And I kind of feel the lid came off and it's not going back on. And I think we now all it's a new dawn, and we have an opportunity to change and make the future better for all. I think, we see this earlier this year. STEM Connector did a report on diversity, equity, and inclusion in STEM. And it's not just the representation of women, it's also the representation of different minority groups is very low in STEM. So I think the good news about 2020 is it basically on the world stage, it exposed some of these social problems that we've had for years. And I think it's now our job to fix this. And I think the mindset is there now. When I talk to people, when I look at our customers at STEM Connector, we have some of the world's largest corporations as our customers. And I would say that every one of them is focused on trying to redress the balance. Dr. Delavo, do you have any thoughts on this area?
Yeah, most of us on this call have been advocates, STEM champions. We've been driving for so many years, and it is kind of discouraging to hear that we're still stagnant. And that's not just true for the medical arena, but it's true for so many other areas in STEM. And one of the reasons why we're doing this call is because we want people to know that you have to see yourself in other people. You have to see that we're here and there are others like us who have been very successful, and we are interested in pulling people up. And I think sometimes people don't know that, but we're committed to that. I think that sometimes I'm encouraged when I partner with some of the local middle schools and I talk to STEM students, and I have them all stand up. We do a very engaging have a conversation about what bothers them. And many of them have a spark around fixing a problem that's personal in their family, a health problem, a diabetes, or any of these diseases that they know has touched them personally. And so sometimes I think for women, we need to have conversations about what makes this personal for you. And so then you get a different perspective on why I should do this. And then secondly, I think a lot of research shows that you have to have a cohort. That's our fancy name for all of us who are in academia, around making sure that we have people who look like us, who reinforce the same things we're studying, who are successful. Some of us call it a posse, right? Everybody has a work posse of people that they say, hey, I'm really not feeling very smart today, even though we're all brilliant. We just don't feel smart all the time. And sometimes we have to call on our colleagues to say, hey, remind me why I'm smart and help me solve this problem again. And so on those days when you feel like quitting, you need to have somebody in that cohort that's going to keep you focused. So I think that we've got to put some systemic things in place. Teachers are really critical. All the research shows that is, if you have a teacher who really is excited about what they do, not just competent, not just, somebody that's a dry lecturer, but they're passionate about it, it's infectious. And so I think there's things we all know, but we're not spending enough time putting together a solid strategy that says I need to make sure that these people have a cohort and they stick with that cohort. I want to make sure I have a teacher that's really excellent. I want to make sure that we hear what problems they want to work on and make that a project for them to start working on early. And so there are other factors that really drive success that I think nationally we're still not doing a great job. We have different pieces of the problem, different institutions, but we're not partnering in a way that is cohesive and integrated to solve this. But I'm encouraged because I do think we're having more deliberate conversations. I know the Women Business Collaborative, we've been talking about how do we show some gains? How do we partner in a way that drives change, a more impactful change? So I'm encouraged by that, but we've got a lot of work to do, hence the conversation we're having.
Indeed, indeed. And Sam, I think you're a lot earlier in your career. What are your thoughts in this area?
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to the previous point when we were speaking about education. And if you think about it, and I mean, I've done a number of companies in a variety of spaces. The most recent over the past 5 or so years was in the blockchain space, and a lot of what interested me about it was the challenging or questioning of existing systems and working together to build new ones. So of course it started with the big question of, is our financial system working for us? And then I moved into supply chain and education systems, looking at pretty much everything. So the question I'd ask here, and Dr. Mallet, you mentioned things like access to grants or approve, and I take a step back and say, is the system itself working for us, or is it a bigger question of, do we want to solve the problems in the existing system, or think of new ways where more people can have access to funding in creative ways, or more people can have access to these networks, or more people can move through an educational progression without necessarily doing it through a university model. So, we live in a time where we have an abundance of information or access to that information. It's historically been held behind folks like ourselves or gatekeepers, and of course, I'm not advocating for a lack of education, but perhaps different models to achieve that and get into the research space. So it's, I tend to go with two solutions of, what can we do immediately within the existing system, but I think we also should be taking a step back and thinking, if we were to build something from the ground up, what could we do?
Well, I wanted to piggyback on what Sam said, because I think that we have to also change the system to reward the way that new approaches to research is being done. So we have citizen science now, and we have people who are inventing things and then recruiting participants in clinical trials from the public, instead of waiting for pharmaceuticals to formally engage. And we have more collaborative approaches to science. And so, for example, at the University of Washington, they created a game. In the game, the game predicted the behavior of certain proteins in a virus. And so, if you contributed to the game and helped to predict the behavior of the next protein, which really helped to then solve what medications might be the next antiviral, how do you then get credit for that in the promotion and tenure that your university is going to recognize your contribution to that science, although not the PI on a grant or the first author on a paper, was critical in a life-changing event that's going to maybe solve for the next Zika virus, or and so we also in academia have to keep up with the new approaches that are happening and not within the old system. As Sam alluded to, people are already going outside the traditional pathways of going through pharma or through the NIH, and are creating new science and new tech-enabled approaches that are novel and more rapid and less institution-based. And we have to reward that in our institutions, or we in academia become stale and out of touch and irrelevant. And so I have advocated at my own institution that we modify what is recognized as promotion worthy as, a YouTube video that educates people broadly and is easily accessible might be just as relevant as a peer-reviewed journal, or even more relevant because it's more useful to the public. And I think it's important that in academia that we keep up with what's actually happening in the real world. And that can sometimes be hard for institutions who have been built on the idea of tradition and what we've always done to keep pace.
No, I think that's you guys have both got a really interesting point there. And when you look at things like 23andMe, they've sent out 10 million DNA kits. So, if they try to do a survey on, say, breast cancer, and they go through that, they can, instead of having a survey of a few thousand women, they could have 2 million women responding to a survey. So I do think a lot of, the new technology, these things are helping us. They're changing the way, the traditional way we've worked in research and medicine. I think it's going to be very interesting over the next few years. My next question is really, this is the world, I think, of Sam and Joe. This is my world, and I think Sam's in this world too. In 2020, Crunchbase reported that just 2.3% of VC funding went to women. In 2019, that figure actually hit an all-time high of 2.8%. So can you say underrepresented? We know that most VC funds don't have a single female partner. And Sam, I'm going to open this one up to you first. Do you have any ideas about how we break up this boys' club and release entrepreneurial women onto the planet?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start by saying that number is atrocious. And I read that article in the Harvard Business Review take on it, and there were quite a few excuses in it saying, perhaps it was risk intolerance due to the pandemic or trusting existing networks, et cetera, et cetera. And I think what's even worse is that's just women. Other underrepresented groups are far lower. So, it's a privilege to even make it to 2.3%. And that's, insane to think about. It's very challenging. So again, to go to the point, sort of my framework of thinking around a lot of these things is, okay, let's talk about the existing system. So we can go through that and say, is it improving networks for female entrepreneurs? Is it ensuring that there are more than 12% of female decision makers in VC funds? Is it moving up the chain to the LPs and saying, how are we bringing in that institutional capital, or reframing incentives so that they are more supportive to the investors? And so that's one way of looking at it. But the reality is there are so many moving parts. And so from the ways that I've been thinking recently, and a lot of the education that I've received in alternative vehicles, alternative funding models, both through community governance or community ownership, community support. We're seeing regulations change, like Reg D or Reg A+, that's actually allowing individual investors, unaccredited investors, to participate in companies. That, again, I think is the system or the model of venture capital really working for any entrepreneur, regardless of how you identify? Because the incentives there, it's pretty limiting in terms of what you as an entrepreneur, what you have to do with that. And there are some models or some ideas or businesses that are just not going to hit that level of scale, or they're not going to become, now you need to be a DECA unicorn to return the fund. So forget about unicorns. You need to make people believe that that's the level of scale, and that is omitting a huge swath of possibilities or problems that need to be solved, or communities. Just because you want to solve a problem in a local area or a national area, that doesn't mean it's not worth receiving some sort of funding. And so I think that model, while it works for some approaches, I think we're getting to a point where we can't be building $1 trillion companies at a certain point. So I think the alternative approach to loans or micro lending, or again, community funding, where you can actually do revenue sharing or give back to a community of, let's say, women or diverse individuals to participate in your company and work towards a mission, would be something that I'm looking into. And so for the company that I'm building right now, we're taking probably a hybrid approach, because we'll need to hit that level of scale. But ultimately, the plan for exit is not traditional, and it's to basically sell it or give it to all of the users on the platform. So it'd be the first truly community-owned and governed company, let's hope, in 5 to 7 years. So I think thinking out of the box and approaching different models is, the advice that I've been taking myself, having done a few different approaches and learning some lessons the hard way.
No, I think that's great. And I think you're right. When you look at VC funding and how VCs work, it does seem like they follow a thread. So if the hot topic is this, everybody wants to invest in that. And when you have a different idea, it doesn't fit into the thesis. And I've certainly been there myself with companies that don't quite fit into the hot spot of where people are going. Do you think, I listened to, a while ago, I listened to an interview of Marissa Mayer, CEO from, she was Google previously, and then she became the CEO of Yahoo. And she is really down to earth and really open. And she made a comment that just struck me hard. And it was that if they could have found a man to do the job, they'd have picked him. They didn't pick me. They picked me because there were problems. The only time you get an opportunity is when there are problems, and that's when they have to bring us in. What do you guys think of that comment? I mean, I was blown away when I heard her say that.
It's absolutely true. So many of, for the longest, in the 158 medical schools in the U.S., there's been between 12 and 16% of them are run by women deans. And the majority of those have been deans that have been interim deans. And so the other dean was fired, and then they brought the woman in, and then she was doing such a great job, they made her the permanent. But inevitably, that person who was fired was a disaster hire in the beginning, and she probably should have been the dean in the first place, but was overlooked, and so. It's very true across the board. My sister has been in the corporate world. She just retired last summer, and she was head of talent acquisition. And she said time and time again, as she tried to promote women to leadership, they only got in these leadership roles when the department was a disaster and it needed a big fix.
Yeah.
And it seems to be, they'll give you the opportunity when failure is inevitable, and then they're amazed when you rise from the ashes. But it shouldn't be that way, obviously. I've had that opportunity in my life more than once. So yeah. Absolutely. As a lived experience.
Crazy. I mean, I've got a bit of a reputation previously as a turnaround CEO, that I would take a company that was failing and I could turn it around. And I'd never really thought about it until I heard Marissa's comment, and I'm like, that's interesting. I'm getting picked and asked to do these jobs when there's a problem to turn it around. And I wonder how many women are out there who CEOs are actually, they're given an unclean sheet to begin with, because that's the way they see coming in. This is a mess. See if you can figure it out. So pretty interesting and pretty sad at the same time. I don't know, Dr. Delavo and Sam, do you guys have any comments on this or any thoughts on this?
I would just echo that experience about being tapped as the turnaround person. And they always present it as a major privilege for you, but it's really heavy lifting. And it sort of goes hand in hand with us having to overperform. And so people that don't look like us sometimes tend to have these standards that are just a higher bar. So I want to go back to something Sam said that is connecting the dot with this whole idea that you only have 12 to 15% of the decision makers in the VC firm. Why I applaud a number of initiatives lately. The one that I think is very high profile is the JP Morgan Chase $350 million investment in minority and women-owned businesses. And I think that's great. I also think, though, that if you read all the reports, it echoes what Sam is saying, that we need more women who are writing the checks, right? Who can actually have, not have the traditional way of looking at a business, but recognize talent, that it's a non-traditional business, that actually this woman has had a vision and has what it takes to actually turn it into a lucrative, high performing, high return on investment opportunity. And if you have everybody with groupthink at these companies and they don't see that, then it's a missed opportunity for us, for the firm, and actually for the value that we can create.
Yeah, very, very good. At this point, I'd just like to invite anybody listening in on this, watching in on this. If you have any comments or questions, please drop them in the chat, and we'll see if we can answer those. The next question I had for the group is, I don't know how much you guys have read about this, but right now we're sitting on a planet, and this is probably, Sam, something you know in your background you've looked at. We're sitting on a planet with about 7.7 billion of us, and over the next 30 years, the population is estimated to increase to just under 10 billion. So that's a 25%, a full quarter increase in the size of our planetary population over just 30 years. And when you look at how do we feed the world, I would argue we're not doing a brilliant job right now feeding the whole planet with this immense increase. And of course, a lot of it is happening in Africa, nations that we struggle with food. The need for technology to help solve these problems seems to be just immense. One of our customers, PepsiCo, one of their lead people in this area, she's asking, is there a more noble cause than going into a STEM career in food and agriculture at the moment? And I think that's a really interesting point. It's not a hot topic for VC firms right now, but when you can see what's coming out here, I just wonder, what are your thoughts around food and agriculture is not traditionally seen as a big place for STEM, but the only way we're going to solve this kind of, be able to feed this kind of population is through the use of technology. And Sam, let's throw it over to you first, if you're okay. What are your thoughts on this?
Again, I would agree with that point. My previous company was supply chain management, supply chain security. We did a lot of work in the food industry, pharmaceutical industry. And a lot of the focus there was on minimizing food waste. And I think that is a big angle, but again, it's a remnant of an existing system. And so again, I come into it and I say, let's blow this apart. We have the technology, we can 3D print organs and things in space. We can vertically farm, we have technologies, but it's not a lack of technology and access to technology. It's a lack of funding, but more importantly, it's a lack of aligned incentives. I mean, we have food now to probably feed a lot more people than we're doing that, but it's because of the way that the business incentives are aligned more so than on the tech side. It's set up in such a way that people are not receiving that. So I don't know if it's fully a problem that can be solved only by advances in various technologies or funding for those, but it's questions about governance and how we actually want to align or incentivize and support this.
That's a very good point. I mean, I think all of us, sat at the dinner table with our parents at some point and didn't want to eat something, like in my case, a Brussels sprout when I was 6 years old. And the parent said, there's children starving in Africa. And I think most kids' response is, well, give them my Brussels sprout. Distribution is a big, big problem here. How do we waste more food in America than the world needs? But how do you control the distribution? And I do think that's where technology can really make a difference. But I take your point, Sam. Somebody's got to pay for it.
And, sorry.
No, go.
No, to your point, that one example. So let's say hypothetically, you wanted to create a local system or food exchange, right? Let's say I have some fruit trees in my yard, or I have extra food and I want to exchange it with neighbors or people in need. In a lot of places, there are regulations in place that make that illegal. So beyond, again, just the incentives, of the financial incentives from the regulatory side, and that's just one small area, there's work to do there. And I question, again, I get that those are food safety regulations, right? But we also need to think about how we can innovate there.
Yep. That makes a lot of sense.
In the U.S., we have huge political challenges to overcome from the massive lobbies of the products that are line the grocery store shelves. So there is a move in medicine for food as medicine, culinary medicine, with the understanding that a lot of what we eat makes us sick and contributes to the poor health that Americans suffer from, our obesity, and that obesity leading to diabetes and hypertension. And we know that much of the processed food that we consume is responsible for that. But the attempts from previous administrations to change the diet in school lunch, for example, was met with massive lobbying and resistance. And if you recall, and Sam probably might not, but the rest of us will recall when lunches for school were made in the school, instead of having vendors from the pizza and fast food companies provide the unhealthy alternatives that our kids are fed. So it's not the lack of tech-enabled modifications to food. Quiet as it's kept, we should all move to a plant-based diet for the climate globally. But we would have so much to overcome from the beef, pork, and poultry industry should we even speak that out loud. So here in North America, I would say we would have a challenge to really embrace what would really reduce greenhouse gases dramatically, and could rapidly have an effect on global warming if we were to venture into that campaign. Sorry, the long guy.
Oh yeah, it always happens, doesn't it? So, well, listen, I think we're up on time. This has been fascinating. The topic we're in right now, I think we could probably talk on this for a while. I also think you start to see Generation Z coming through. A lot of vegetarians and vegans in Generation Z. So I think some of the youth may be helping us change this, hopefully over time. But I want to thank you sincerely, all three of you today. I think it's just been a great topic. I think we could go for hours. We could cover a lot of different topics with the experience we have with this group. But thank you so much for your time today.
And thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
funky. Hi, everyone. Nice to see you all. And hello to everyone who's joining us for this session on women in investing for the future. We're going to be having a dialogue about empowering women around their money and helping them put their money to work for themselves and for the world. And I am being joined by 3 other panelists, as you can see. Since you have our full bios, rather than going into a long discussion on who each of us is, we're going to do brief intros, and then we're going to move right into the subject matter. I'm kicking us off, but I'm not going to moderate the panel. We're actually looking to have more of a discussion, and we are going to be asking each other questions. So this may feel a little different to you than some of the other panels, but I think it'll be a really enjoyable conversation. So to kick us off on the introductions, I'm Janine Firpo, and I'm the author of a new book called Activate Your Money, which is intended to help women take control of their money, build their confidence as investors, and put their money to work for themselves and for the world. And I'm joined by Heather Ettinger, who is the CEO of Luma Wealth Advisors. She is also an author and a thought leader and a nationally recognized innovator in the space of the financial services industry. So welcome, Heather.
Glad to be here.
And we have Pat Shea. And Pat has been a leader in corporations and nonprofits. Most recently, she was the founder and CEO of a tech startup that was looking at helping workplace giving and volunteerism. But now she's really putting her energy and thought into helping expand philanthropy and helping expand what we think of when we think of philanthropy. And you'll hear more from her about that. And finally, we're joined by Michael Norris, who is a successful entrepreneur, investor, and community developer who works with women, and he supports organizations like Million Women Mentors. So as I said earlier, this is really a panel about women and our money and how we can manage, invest, and gift our assets in ways that are really more meaningful to us. And as you can see, we have one male on our panel. And so to make sure that he doesn't feel marginalized, we're going to ask him the first question. So Michael, in earlier conversations, you talked a lot about the fact that you're doing work with women and minorities. So would you please tell us a little bit about why you're doing that, how you're working with them and their money, and explain to us what you think are some of the changes that need to take place going forward. If you would, please. Michael? Can you hear us? So I'm not sure why we're not hearing from Michael, but I'm going to suggest that we wait for him to come back to us. And Heather, could you talk to us a little bit about what you're doing around women and money? I know you've spent over 30 years working as a financial advisor with them. And I would love to hear, and I think others would too, what your expectations and hopes are for them for the future.
Sure. So thank you so much, Janine. And I'm so excited to be a part of this panel because it's such an important message. And I think all of us are pretty closely aligned, even though we're pursuing it a little bit differently. So to start with my why, which does date back to the inception really of my career, is that I learned very early on, if we educate and empower women, they are the agents of social change. So that is why my feet hit the floor every day. So what is important in kind of looking at the future of women and how they think about investing, whether that be public markets, private markets, charitable giving, and being giveful, as Pat will talk about? Well, first of all, the majority of women want advisors, but only 20% have them, and 80% leave meetings feeling misunderstood. And over 50% feel that the industry is not meeting their priorities and values. And in fact, there was a study done by Oliver Wyman a few years ago that indicated if the financial services actually served women the way they should be, and meeting their needs and their interests, it's called the $700 billion missed opportunity. So ladies, we have a lot of power that we need to embrace. And believe me, you are going to drive change in the industry. So first, what is that? Well, for men, often money is kind of the end game. Not Michael, as you'll hear, but for women, money is a means to a number of ends. It's not an end in and of itself, whether that's key life stages and things that you want for your family, whether that's driving your investments into things like ESG, environmental social governance, and sustainability, or investing in female and minority entrepreneurs, or how you gift your money. That is where women are really looking for partners in that journey rather than just investment managers. So how do we look at it? Well, we talk a lot about financial health, but financial health is really essentially your balance sheet, assets and liabilities, and your cash flow, which is what's coming in and what's going out, right? Financial wellness, which is what my book is about, is really looking at it almost like we would integrative medicine. How can we be proactive? How can we have alignment of our values and priorities with our lives and what we want to accomplish in those lives, whether it's job purpose, our relationships, our community, etc. And the fact of the matter is that you have a lot more power than likely you realize. And I'm going to tell you a story. So, wonderful client, and I'll call her Barbara. When I first met her, she had an advisor who was more interested in what he was doing and making money off of her than really aligning around her values. And the first meeting that I was called into with him, he basically spent 2 hours talking and never gave her a chance to talk. I ran into her a few days later and she said, Heather, what do you think? And I said, I have no idea what to think because I don't know what you want. I don't know what your values and priorities are. I know what he thinks they are. And he was suggesting things like move to Florida. It's a great tax break for you. And a number of other things like that. And so I said to her, listen, I want to come sit in your living room and just talk to you and just ask you a bunch of questions. And so we did that. And I will fast forward in the interest of time, but I would tell you, we sent her life on a completely different trajectory. And it included thinking about how her funds were invested, and probably even more powerfully around how she could create her charitable giving impact in her lifetime. And she was giving randomly all over the place. And instead, we focused on 3 organizations that she had a deep passion for. She made pretty significant gifts, took advantage of the tax opportunities, etc. And by bringing all the advisors together around her purpose, by the way, the other advisor did get fired, around her purpose, meaning her estate planner, her CPA, etc., we were able to transform her impact in her lifetime. And I'm happy to say one of those programs, for example, has impacted over 6,000 young women. That's what it's about when we talk about what the future could look like and what financial wellness is, as opposed to just, financial health. So with that, Janine, I don't know should we go back to Michael and let him answer the first question, or?
I think that what I want to say, I think just follows on with you so well. So let's proceed, and we can bring in Michael in a moment, all right? But I think, so much of what you said in terms of our ability as women to step into our power and really think about our money differently is so, so, so important. It's something that I've really learned too. I mean, I left a 35-year career in international development and technology 3 years ago because I wanted to help other women do what I've done. And what I did was about 10 years ago, I made the decision to invest all of my assets, my cash, my fixed income, my bonds, my stocks, private deals, real estate, everything I had in alignment with my values, because it was so meaningful to me. What I had learned is I lived my life in integrity. I was doing a lot of things in the world. I'd chosen a career that was making a difference in the world. And yet at some point I realized that my money was actually working in opposition to me. And I didn't want that. I mean, for so many of us, our money is really an afterthought. Many of us run away from our money. Only 9% of women think that we're better investors than men. 9% of us. And that is true of women like us who have advanced degrees, who have successful careers, even women who have careers in the financial services industry, in banking, etc., don't think about their own money, and they just hand it over to somebody else to manage it for them. Well, guess what, ladies? By 2030, we are going to control the majority of money in this country, the majority of money, and that's just going to go up over the next 30 years as there is this enormous transfer of wealth, as our husbands and partners and other people die, and as we are earning more ourselves. Half of the 45 million millionaires in this country are women today. We have incredible financial power, and we don't recognize it. And as Heather was saying, we actually don't want to invest the way men do. And when we do invest, by the way, we outperform them. So we want more from our money than just financial return. We want to know that our money is doing good things in the world too. And I am in testament to the fact that you can invest your money in the things you care about and get financial return. So this is absolutely possible. And I wrote the book, Activate Your Money, because I wanted to help other women learn how to do this as well. So I think it's a really important point, and I think that we can really start to think differently about our money. And if enough of us start to do this, if enough of us start to move our assets into alignment with our values, into our communities, into things that support our families, that support the planet, that support other women, power goes where money flows. And so when we control the money and we step into that power, then what is important in this economy changes. And we can together, we can create a more sustainable and equitable economy and a more sustainable and equitable society. So I'm going to turn over to Pat. We will come back to Michael, but I'm going to turn over to Pat because I think what you're trying to do also really extends this conversation about how we feel fulfilled around our money and how we feel more grateful for what we have and for more grateful for what we can do. So I know that you have talked a lot about a concept of being giveful, and it would be really interesting to learn from you what you mean from that and why you think it's so important for women to think a little bit differently about their money.
Thank you, Janine. It's fun to be on the panel with you and Heather and Michael. So this is kind of cool. So my why is really, I believe giving is our currency, the way that we operate on the face of this earth as human beings. And being giveful for me, I want to start a movement of being giveful. I want to radically grow the number of givers and the amount given, specifically by women. So for me, being giveful is a continuous practice of conscious creative giving. So when I say continuous, I mean it becomes a way of life. It's part of who you are every day. When I use the word conscious, I mean you're present. You know what's going on around you and you see things that you could do to make the world a better place. And creative is I want you to think outside the box. There are lots of rules and regulations. There are great ways to give to maximize your money, but I want you to give to maximize your heart. So why is being giveful so important to women right now? Well, it goes back to what Janine and Heather both said. We're coming into a lot of money. Whenever I bring that up to my husband, it makes him nervous. but we are coming into a lot of money, and we have our own way of managing our presence on this earth. So while all of us, while women are coming into positions of power, Mother Earth has more needs than ever, and so does humanity. And I just really think women have an opportunity to think about the world and the people we live with differently. I think women are the key. I have seen women over my 18 years of running nonprofits and my last 3 years of running a tech company focus on giving from their heart. I've watched mothers, I've watched CEOs, I've watched teachers, nurses, who understand that if you leave the thinking mind and really get into the heartfelt giving, you'll experience giving in a way where you get to see and feel the benefits of what you do. And I'll give you just a simple example. When I first met Mary, she was a victim of domestic violence. It was Thanksgiving. She was staying in our shelter. The first met Helen. She was a huge philanthropist in Nashville, gave away millions of dollars. But over the course of the 11 years where I worked at the YW, Mary and Helen had a bond. Helen gave Mary $1,000 every year for 4 years so that Mary could go to college, and Helen paid for her books. And those two women got to know each other. And even though I know Helen has given millions away, I would tell you her experience in that $1,000 impacting Mary's life so that Mary could become a college graduate and then ultimately have her 2 children who are fatherless become college graduates. That impact will go on in Helen's life and Mary's life forever. So it really is time to recast giving and move away from what I call obligatory or transactional giving and really move to heartfelt giving, having our hearts wide open, doing the work of the world 1 minute at a time. And again, the importance is now because things are divisive. We are divided by politics and COVID and racial and social issues. You know, we have conversations that make us think we're separate, but we're not. We're all one human race. We're also kind of fed a line of bull that says the more you have, the happier you are. But I think we all really know what Buddha says is true. Happiness is not having a lot, it's giving a lot. It's time for women to step up. It's time for women to give from their heart. Another quote I love, and I'm going to change it to fit my needs, but the winds of opportunity are always blowing. There are continuous opportunities to give. All we have to do is be aware, raise our sails, and be giftful. So Michael, this is a perfect time to go to you because of all that you're doing. So would you talk to us about the work you're doing with minorities and women and how your personal experiences, your investments, your partnerships are changing and driving improvements for those populations?
Well, thank you, Patricia. And I'm excited to be on the panel with all of you today and talking to everyone about this subject. And I will spend a little bit more time maybe emphasizing a little bit of the issues around minority women in particular, because as Janine and Heather and you have pointed out, there's a million ways to give and not enough of them being done. So certainly some major work needs to be done in those areas. But, you know, women of color and minorities in general have a much even more difficult time with financial future planning, developing, and even at the core of the being before that, receiving the funds and the sponsorships and the mentorship and the participation necessary for them. I think Janine was pointing out, according to the U.S. Census Bureau, women of color make up about 39% of the female population today and 20% of the entire population. And according to the nonprofit research at Catalyst, the women will be the total minority, as Jeannie pointed out, by 2060. And that being the case, we need to invest now in this group of individuals who are getting less than anybody out there. Black women founders and entrepreneurs and people searching desperately for the capital and the success and needing investors and mentor supporters just aren't finding it. In fact, this it's amazing. A basis point of investment from venture capitalists came into play from 2009 through 2019 to help women of color in particular. And if you don't have the money to even start, and you don't have the backing to be able to do it, and even if you have some and can get started, if you don't have the ability to expand, then oftentimes not only can you not benefit from the profit and the success of what you could do, But that idea then, quickly gets eaten up by somebody else and it gets taken away. So then once again, it looks like you failed where you didn't. You just didn't have the capacity or the ability to do that. So over my 20-year career, I've spent a good deal of time trying to invest, but corporately as a CEO and then individually with different minority communities and individuals and women in particular, to help them to find the capital to start with. And I can tell you, there's many different ways we've gone about this in the past. I spent many years on the board of the United Negro College Fund. I can tell you that if you can invest early stage, and Dr. Joe at the last speaker on here before us was STEM Connector, we talked about the fact that when you invest in women early on and you can have a pipeline of women that are being taught, trained, and developed, and I think we're all going to get into this some more here, you're in a much better position to do that. And I'll come back to once you help with a pipeline of women being educated, and they're doing the work. They're basically putting in the emphasis and the time and the education and the background for people to believe in them and take them further. So I've spent an awful lot of years working on the side of it, and as we go through this, I'll give you some specific examples and some other ones too, where we can do a great job, and we need to. The success of our country and our future depends desperately on us investing in this group of people who are going to be our majority. Educate them, support them, invest in them, participate with them, learn from them. It's not just a one-way street, and we're all going to be in a position that is going to do that. And I'm glad to come back to that again.
Great. Well, I'm just going to jump in there, Michael, because I really agree with what you're talking about. I mean, this issue, and I think that this is really an opportunity for women who have some level of wealth. I mean, a lot of us know about the stock market. We're told as women to save our money, and guess what? We really learn that. In fact, the vast majority of women keep 70 cents on the dollar in cash. So what that means is they are losing money year on year. And then we're told to invest in the stock market, and we do that, and we invest in index funds primarily. But nobody really talks to us about what men do, which is they do private investing. They invest in private companies. They help other men build businesses. We are not as involved in that as women. And so there's been a lot of talk about the fact that there are not a lot of female entrepreneurs out there. That's not true. The truth is there's not money for them. In fact, in 2019, only 2.8% of all venture capital in this country went to female CEOs. And that is not only is that terrible, but it went down to 2.3% in 2020. So the trend is going in the wrong direction. If we talk about Black female entrepreneurs, we're talking about less than 1% of venture capital in this country goes to them. So we've got a very biased system. We have an entrenched system. And what we're starting to see is women are starting to step up as investors and angel investors. I'm one. I can't tell you how much fun it's been. I love investing in other women and helping them succeed. And the other thing to know is that although we're all excited about venture capital and equity investing, only 1% of the new companies in this country are actually eligible for that kind of funding. So that means 99% of new companies aren't even equity ready. That's not the kind of capital they need. And a lot of those companies can't get loans from banks. In fact, about 81% of all new companies can't get money, period. And a lot of those companies are started by females and by people of color. And I invested in a company like that in my local community. I invested in a woman who was starting a bagel shop. And I really believed in her. She was really smart. Her financials were amazing. I did my due diligence on her. I invested in her company. I gave her a loan. I was part of a pool of people who lent her money. She opened her bagel shop in November of 2019. 4 months later, we were in COVID. We all know what happened to restaurants. Well, this woman excelled. She had, before COVID, she had people down the street in line, trying to get into her store. And after COVID, she pivoted and she paid us all back in full a year early. So every time I go by her store, I feel so happy to see the success that she had because I know that I played a little bit in that. The other thing I just want to bring up is that a lot of us don't really know what our money is invested in, and we don't realize that across all asset classes, it's probably supporting things that we abhor. And so I love philanthropy. I love what Pat is doing. I love the idea of being more giftful, but I think it's really important to recognize that only a part of our money goes into our philanthropy. The vast majority of it is invested in other things. And if those other things are not supporting your values, then the fact that you're doing some work with philanthropy, in my view, is not enough. We can do so much more. And we can do that by putting all of our assets to work in ways that matter to us. And we can do that by supporting other women. And we can do that, as Pat says, by being more giveful as well. So there are so many ways to do this. Heather, did you have some thoughts?
Sure. So thank you, Janine. I think that really tees up well two other points. You mentioned investing in your local community. And I think I keep saying women are the tsunami of economic power that's going to drive change. And so many of us in our local communities have opportunities to fund female entrepreneurs, have opportunities to join groups like Invest in Women or Portfolio and others who will educate us on investments as well as help us find investments that are aligned with our values. So I think that's really an important piece. The second is I'm going to ask you all for a big favor. And that is that, first of all, less than 20%, about 17% of financial advisors are women. And then when we talk about women of, or even people of color or Asian descent, et cetera, it drops even lower. And I'm talking kind of in the range of 2 to 4%. So here's another important thing that you can think about. We need more like-minded advisors who are educating themselves on this path. And I think, Janine, you were kind of making that point earlier, so that then they can bring along their clients, male and female, and of all different backgrounds, to better support their, the earth with their investments, or women in advancing, et cetera. So my kind of point to all of you is ask for those advisors, ask for women. I have an advisory council member who's a woman of color, and she said, Heather, I decided that is such an important part of my journey. I was going to find a female advisor of color because I wanted somebody who understood where I was coming from. So I ask all of you, do that, because there are those of us, and many of us in WBC, like Lynn Bourne and Alex Young, et cetera, that are trying to drive change in the industry. But the fact of the matter is, if you all ask for those types of advisors, we're going to hit them from two sides, right? And that can really help advance the industry as well. So Pat, I'm gonna flip to you for a moment and just ask you to talk a little bit more about how you've gone on your journey and how maybe you've aligned your Giveful with finding advisors and partners and others who are with you in that journey.
Thank you. I'm not on.
Pat, you're on mute.
Thank you. I love listening to everybody because I keep talking about being giveful as creative giving. I want to broaden the term giveful to include investing in women-owned companies and putting money where you're not really thinking today that it's traditional philanthropy. So philanthropy, if you go to the root origin, philanthropy actually means the love of humanity. So that alone broadens the concept of what we can do when we're being philanthropic. The definition is really promoting the welfare of others and trying to make the world a better place for people. But philanthropy in its traditional sense, for me, has really gotten off course. We talk about philanthropy as if it's only for the wealthy, but I think every human being can be a philanthropist. And a lot of people who think about philanthropy think about how to reduce taxes or to use current contributions to build their wealth for future philanthropy. Another thing I see a lot in philanthropy is people use philanthropy to improve their business brand, their personal brand, or their continuing family giving, obligatory giving, just company traditions. It was actually funny. I talked to a CEO recently about their company's giving, and he said really clear to me, we support 3 nonprofits, and they are blah, blah, and blah. And 100% of our company gives to them, and they are delighted. Now, do you really think 100% of this very large 58,000 person company are happy giving to 3 charities that support the brand of the organization they work for? No way. So I'm really saying, go out of your mind, get into your heart. This week, I ran into 2 opportunities that I was very outspoken. I was congratulating a young woman who graduated from graduate school with a $30,000 debt. She told me in the same breath that her aunt just sold her company, probably put $10 million in her bank account. And I said, call her, tell her you have $30,000 in debt, ask her to pay it off. I don't think her aunt is aware of that giveful opportunity. So I just go back to, I really want women to be uber present, to see what's around them, to view giving as something they can do continuously, and don't be caught by just the rules. Second thing for me is really realize when you break out of the mold of tax reduction, you can broaden the benefits of giving. And there are a lot of benefits of giving. It's really good for you when you feel in your heart and soul the benefit of your giving. It improves your physical well-being, your mental well-being, and basically whatever religion you're supporting, it's what God says to do. So I just kind of want to broaden. I want to broaden giving. I want to break up philanthropy. And I want to say, when you invest in that woman's startup, you are being giveful. When you're paying off someone's college debt, the woman that bought my coffee the other day at Starbucks, paid it forward, she was being giveful. And I'm going to go back to the very beginning. Women are coming into a lot of money. Let's break the rules and let's open our hearts. Let's be truly giveful. So Janine, I'm turning it to you.
Okay, so I would agree with you. And I actually, for me, being giveful doesn't only include those philanthropic dollars. Remember, if you're a foundation, let's pretend we're foundations. Foundations only have to give away 5% of their principal every year. That's it, 5%. The other 95 is doing who knows what. So for me, being giveful doesn't only mean thinking about my philanthropy. It means thinking about what all of my money is doing.
You are so right, Janine. And plus, when you think that 95% is sitting still, where there are people still hungry today or homeless tonight, I mean, that logic really needs to be challenged.
And it's really, I mean, the thing that's really great is you can think about supporting your community through something as simple as moving the assets you have in your checking and savings account into a bank that's a community bank. As long as it is FDIC insured or insured by another federal agency known as the NCUA, your money is safe. And it's going to work in your community. It's going to work for female entrepreneurs. It's going to work for underserved people. It's going to work for the climate. It's going to work for a lot of things that we care about. That is a super simple thing that anyone can do, right? And so there are many ways to think about this, the way we invest our stocks, the way we invest all of our money. But for me, being giveful means thinking across the whole scope of our money. And so not to leave him out, I'd love to go back to Michael and see if you have any other thoughts on the conversation or how this applies to the that you're doing.
Well, you 3 ladies are so inspiring, and it gets exciting listening to all the examples that you're sharing, especially in bagel factories, local investing, and things like that. I've done that for a long time. You can regentrify entire neighborhoods and reinvest in women, and they tend to invest many times very locally. And what they do is local and in their neighborhoods. I opened a lot of Magic Johnson theaters in inner city communities that didn't have types of entertainment like that. And what's interesting is in the communities that we invest in, especially with women, the dollar travels 14 times in a normal community. You spend your money, you make your money, you spend it, you pay rent, you pay a house payment, you go to the dry cleaner, you go to the bagel factory, you go to all these different things. That doesn't happen in a lot of these communities. They work outside their community. They don't have stores there, so they never can actually build that inner community, and the investment doesn't come back to women there. It's very hard to do. And Heather's point on the social aspect, the call to action is to have people who have the ability to invest with women, and especially minority women, to do so. If you have a seat at the table, I would suggest that it is your responsibility to pound that table and basically, promote someone, sponsor someone, either corporately or financially or in another way, because it's an absolute, God-given right for you to do that sort of thing. And it's very difficult for women in that community. I think, Heather, you were explaining the person who didn't listen to them. Well, it's even harder for minority women who can't find someone who looks like them, who basically can't give them that advice, who has been there before them, who is willing to share with them, that can give them the advice, knows where they're coming from, understands their difficulties, and is willing to invest. And even like the investments made early on for a pipeline of STEM Connector and Million Women Mentors and things we've all been part of and done in the past, if we can invest early enough in women, minority women, support them, give them the needs, tools, and things to do. We've had a Canyon Fund where we had a $1 billion fund investing in minorities getting money to buy homes when they couldn't get anywhere else. And the payback rate in that was just as good, if not better, than the average payback rate for anyone else. It's not a risk. The risk is not in doing it. The risk really is in the fact that we haven't spent enough time and we haven't invested severely enough. And I applaud the three of you in particular for your articles, your books, what you've done in support on that, and it's inspiring.
Janine, can I add one more point, because it's really important and follows well onto what Michael's saying. So as more of us are also serving on boards, whether they're non-for-profit or for-profit, we should be asking these same questions as well. So where are they invested? Is that aligned with the mission of the organization? Because I'm making an assumption we're joining organizations that have a mission that resonates with us. So whether that be their investments, how are they investing in the talent of the organization? Women, minorities, and how do we invest our time and talent, if you will, to helping those people? So for example, I'm on a hospital board and I am really focused on helping advance the women in leadership, making sure they have the resources that they need. So this is, yes, investing our own money, but it's also where we may have influence in our communities to have an even larger impact. And these are boards that have 2-3 billion in the marketplace. So we can flex some muscle there and start asking the questions that I think can even broaden the influence more, if you will.
That is such an excellent point. And I think you're absolutely right that we do have the ability to have influence in a lot of places, and using that influence is important. But for us to be able to use that influence, we have to know something about how to invest this way, right? And the problem is that nobody is telling us. And so that is exactly why I wrote the book. And you talked earlier, Heather, about the fact that we can go out and find the financial advisors that we want. And that's really true. And one of the chapters in my book is about how to find financial advisors, what they do, what they should do for you, and how you can find financial advisors that are values aligned and can help you invest in this way. So for those women who want to use a financial advisor, you can absolutely do that. For those women who want to become more educated, and I think even if you have a financial advisor, it's super smart to be educated. It's super smart to be able to know enough about investing and enough about how your money is invested and enough about the returns you should be getting to ask intelligent questions of your advisor. It's kind of shocking to me how many women don't really know what they're invested in or why they're invested the way they are. And then, I have had women who come to me who are approaching their retirement years, who are just then looking at what their investments are in and realizing that whoever put them in those investments didn't necessarily make the best choices for them, and they are behind the 8 ball in terms of being prepared for retirement. So knowing about these issues and knowing your choices, and if you have a financial advisor who tells you, oh, you can't invest in a way that aligns with your values because you're going to give up financial return, fire them and go find somebody who will help you, because that is not true. And there's a tremendous amount of data out there to prove it. So
Exactly.
Really, really, really hear your point. And I think this is something that we should do for ourselves, should do for the foundations we're associated with. Again, one of the quotes, I put a quote in my book from Melinda Gates, and I actually worked at the Gates Foundation as the last part of my career, but I love what she says because I think it's really true. And she says, when money flows into the hands of women who have the authority to use it, everything changes. I think it's a very powerful quote. So Pat, you're looking like you have something you want to add to the conversation.
No, I just think that's a great exclamation point for kind of what we're all saying here this morning, is money does show what we believe, and it is our power as well. And we need to be thinking about it, using it and understanding it to, feed our soul and improve the world. But we have to understand it first. So I love your line about just fire them. And I've done that. So I thought that was great.
Well, 75% of women who are either divorced or retired, divorced or widowed is what I meant to say. When that happens to them, 75% of them fire their financial advisors, because those financial advisors were often hired by their spouses, and those men, and they're usually men, 83% of financial advisors are men, don't listen to them.
Yes.
Don't listen to them. In fact, I did a series of chats leading up to the publication of the book, and one of the chats I had was with the women who helped me write the financial advisor chapter. They are they're with a company called Values Advisor. But I asked the question, what is one of the most important qualities you would look for in a financial advisor? And the answer I got from Kate Simpson, who was on my show that day, was really surprising to me. She said, someone who listens. And I had not expected that answer at all. I was expecting her to say a fiduciary, somebody who puts your financial interests before their own, or, somebody who understands values. That's what I was expecting. But she talked about listening, and I realized that she hit the nail on the head.
And that makes great sense.
What Heather was saying, which is women want to be listened to. They want their values to be heard. They want their needs to be addressed. And they are looking for much more than just financial return. They want that. Let's be clear. We're not a bunch of idiots who are saying, oh, we'll take less return than that. Great. We want that, but we want more. And the great news is we can have it.
I think there are two other things real quick, Janine, that have come from the thought leadership work that I've done. One is, and this came from interviewing over 500 women, 96% of women said, I want you to show an understanding of what's unique about me and my family before you start giving me advice. So I think that's really important, and that gets to the listening and all that you indicated. And I think, the second is that there are advisors, and in my book, I actually also have a chapter in the appendix on what to ask when looking for an advisor and what to know about the answers you might get. And I think that's part of it, is just having a little bit more clarity around the information that you receive. And I think that's really important as we move forward. There are resources. There's a whole book resource for today that has been put together, which is really exciting. And I think it's important that people just start wherever they're comfortable. And I think, your book and my book pair well, because mine kind of takes a step back and says, really take the time to look at what your values and priorities are, so that you can articulate them. And then yours is a great follow-on as well. So I think it's really a great partnership in that way.
You know, one of the things that I spent 20 plus years working in international development and poverty alleviation. And one of the things that I learned about as a result of that work is something called the Sustainable Development Goals. And these are 17 very high level goals to create a better world that were established by leaders of 35 different countries and then ratified by all of the 190 plus countries in the United Nations. These sustainable development goals are things like no poverty, gender equity, sustainable cities and communities, clean water, these kinds of things. And they are being worked on by governments, by corporations, by individuals all over the world. And they are becoming a sort of de facto standard within what's known as the impact investing space, right? So for people who are looking to align their money with their values, these are becoming more commonplace. And I've found that they are a great way to identify what your values are in terms of how you can make tangible choices about investing. And I've chosen 5 personally. And I now, every single dollar I have is being put to work against one or more of those 5 goals. And that includes the money that I have in philanthropy. It's all going against that. And the thing that makes it really great is it's so easy for me now as an angel investor to say no to deals that aren't in that space. It's so easy for me in philanthropy when somebody comes to me and says, I want you to gift to X. I can easily say, you know what? No, I really appreciate what you're doing, but I have a plan. I've already allocated my money for this year, and all of my money is going to these goals. And it helps me keep track of them and see how the world is changing around those goals, and helps me feel great that I know that my money is doing a little bit to help create that change. So I think getting clear on our values is really, really important. Unless anyone has anything to add, what I'd love to do, because I think we only have about a few minutes left, is to go to each of us and have each of us say one thing we would love people to take away from today's conversation. So if anyone has anything to add, please do. Otherwise, I'm going to go to Pat and ask Pat, what would be the one thing that you would love people to take away from today's conversation?
To really embrace the concept of being giveful with their money and their time and their talent, and keep it in the present, because the needs are great and women can make a huge difference.
Great. Michael, do you have a takeaway?
I think the most important thing for me would be to say that all of us who, and so much around what you've all said already, but all of us that are in positions to basically advance the concept that we can invest in women and women of color, and specifically for us to invest our time, our treasure, and our talents in equal proportions that will enable us to them to do so. If you're a person giving contracts out, you should, as part of your contract, I would ask you look at it and say, is 25% of this going to minority firms? Is blank percentage of it going to women? It should, everyone needs to drink from the well. And I think that if you're in a position to actually, create those situations to happen and measure them for outcome, then I think we'll all be better off.
I want to tag on, because I think mine kind of builds on both of theirs, Janine, and that is, since we have women leaders and women business owners on here, all know that what gets measured gets done. So if this is a new space, even if it's not a new space to you to measure kind of outcome, start by creating your own scoreboard, your own scorecard, your own dashboard. What are you doing in terms of your giving? Where's it going? Does that reflect your values? What are you doing in terms of your investments? And if you're starting at 0, what's the next small step? and just create that dashboard. And it's a really good time because around tax time, you can look back on your charitable giving, you can look back on your annual reports and really get some of that data that'll help you understand your alignment.
So I am gonna totally tag on what you just said, Heather. So based on the experience that I've had in writing my book and in talking to other women, I think one of the places to really start is just to ask yourself, where's my money? Do you even know? If you have a financial advisor, have they really told you? And if you don't have a financial advisor, if you have some type of a retirement account, why did you put your money where it is? What if you're in an index fund, what is that fund really holding? Are you really in the right things? How's your money diversified? Why? Are those the things you want to be in? So I would start by just questioning these things. And then once you start to figure out how your money is allocated, decide whether that's the right thing for you or you want to change it. And also look at what are you holding in terms of impact? Because every single dollar you have is making an impact in the world. Every dollar, even what you have in your savings account. And the question is that impact supporting something you care about, or is it working in opposition to what you care about? And this is not as hard as it sounds. It's actually super easy. And I talk about this in Activate Your Money. We give you the tools to help you answer these questions, not only about what you hold, but what those holdings are doing in terms of impact. And we point you to investments in every asset class that you can make that are more aligned with your values and teach you how to find and do your own homework on finding the things that matter to you. So start with asking the question, what do I have and why do I have it? And is that really what I want to have?
Janine, maybe we could throw one in, since we're all part of the Women's Business Collaborative and they've hosted us today. You know, their measure of achievement that they've set by 2020 and the 40-some partners that we've been lucky enough to partner with out there. We've asked for 25% of women in C-suites by women of color by 2030. 25% of the CEOs are women of color. And then finally, 25% of board members are women of color, all of which we're trying to set a goal of with the WBC by 2030.
Great.
That's the exclamation point, Michael.
Yeah. Thank you for adding that, Michael. It's terrific. So I think we're out of time. I've been looking for questions in the chat. I haven't seen any. So I thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for having been on this panel with me. And it's really been a pleasure getting to know all three of you in the process of bringing this panel together. Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
I can't hear you. I can't hear you. Can you speak now?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you now. Now, yes, I can hear you.
That was me. That was Jose. You can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so it's just Lynn, and we're still waiting for Donald.
Can anyone hear Lynn?
No.
She's got to go set her mic to the right mic. She's got to go back to the beginning of the settings. If you look at settings, go to cam mic, look at settings, you're probably on the wrong mic.
How about that? Is that any
There
better?
you go. There you go.
Well, thank you, Lorraine, for being my tech person.
I have so much experience that I don't want to tell you about that everyone goes through. Now,
very good. It all looked fine on the screen. Well, thank you so much. So I'm going to get rolling now. So I just want to thank everybody. What an amazing day thus far. The panels have been absolutely fascinating. I just got off the Women in Capital panel. I learned so much. My name is Lynn Bourne. I'm the chair of the strategy of WBC, and I'm a former CEO and president of high net worth accounting firms and RIAs, both in New York City and in Silicon Valley. And I'm very pleased to be facilitating this panel with some world-class experts on the topic. So why don't we go ahead and just dive in. We are waiting for our fourth panelist, so hopefully he will overcome whatever technical difficulties he's having and join us soon. But what we want to talk about today is accountability. How do we build in accountability for companies when they have made a commitment to diversity and inclusion? And this conversation aligns beautifully with WBC's core mission to accelerate progress, because frankly, in the market, we have stalled at numbers that are too low, and this is simply just not acceptable for this to continue. So I gave this a lot of thought. Imagine if you were the CEO of a company and you'd built a strategic plan and you had milestones and targets and objectives and goals and you told the whole market, and then you moved into execution mode and you said, well, I'm actually not going to tell either my team or the market how I'm doing. I'm not going to hold anybody accountable. There'll be no communication or messaging around progress. You just kept that whole part a secret. Well, I think we could all safely say that if any CEO built a plan like that, we know it would be doomed to fail, because it is execution that drives your plan forward, execution and accountability. I also thought about the racial unrest in 2020 and the number of companies that made public statements of support for people of color. But now that time has passed, we're kind of looking back, and so many of those companies didn't put any action, accountability, or real change behind those promises. So of the largest publicly traded US companies, 86% disclosed their diversity policy. So note I said policy, which is a piece of paper, but only 11% disclose actual measurable targets and data. That includes parity at the leadership level and compensation data. I can't tell you the number of folks I've been talking to lately that when they're going to work with a company or hire a company and they ask, what's your diversity data? And the company says, oh, we're 50-50 women to men, or, you know, we have this proportion of people of color. And then if you ask the question, well, tell me about your leadership team, it's so often a completely different set of metrics. And so they're not really honestly looking at the challenge and issue and how to solve it. So this commitment to gender diversity and equity and accountability, it needs to be more than just a piece of paper. So I am pleased today to be joined by two amazing, distinguished leaders in the field of transparency and accountability. And hopefully Donald will join us as well. But Lorraine Harriton is CEO of Catalyst, which I think we all know Catalyst, the premier thought leadership and best practice organization that helps companies build workplaces that work for women. And Jose Zalestra, the CEO of the amazing Gender Fair. Talk about accountability. Gender Fair has put their money where their mouth is, and they are a trusted independent resource that publicly identifies companies that support equality. So we're going to hear about Gender Fair as well. So why don't we'll just go ahead and get started with this discussion. Let's start with the first question for both of you. What trends are you seeing where measurement, data, and transparency are becoming increasingly important to accelerate gender equality and diversity? And are the pressures to step up about more transparency coming from companies, from employees, from investors, from consumers? So what are you seeing? And why don't we start with you, Lorraine? And if you want to add anything to your introduction, feel free as well.
Yeah, thank you, Lynn. And this is such a hot topic right now. We are seeing a focus on measurement because you need to measure what matters. And so this focus on trying to get accountability around this is really broad-based. And it actually starts with the fact that human capital is becoming the asset on the balance sheet. If you go back 50, 100 years, you had a amount of manufacturing. Now human capital is really where people are focused. So investors and all stakeholders are really looking at how do they measure this really important asset. That coupled with the fact that we're right now have a war for talent. People are really focused on talent. And the focus on equity that's come out of this pandemic. And even before the pandemic, there's been a move to look at ESG measures and hold companies accountable for a much broader set of metrics. So you see governments, regulatory organizations looking for this data. I mean, Europe's been ahead of the United States on this, but we also see states like the state of California asking for certain numbers and commitments and targets at the board level. We see the SECs trying to start to measure some of these things. We see regulatory and reporting organizations like ISS asking for this. And they're doing it because, having the other side of it is an understanding, and there's been a lot of research on this, that organizations that are more diverse, that have more diversity of thought, more diversity of representation, are going to get better results. And also that they're going to represent their consumer base and the needs of their consumers better. We also see that other stakeholders, the employees, the supply chain, customers are looking at companies on a broader basis around diversity. So, Joanna is like a real expert on this, and she can probably give you an even more nuanced view on why this is like really bubbling up to really being a top focus across all the stakeholder communities.
Before we go there, Lorraine, you said, for example, Europe is ahead. Are they ahead in governmental situations or business situations? So there's a role model out there that exists that we could mirror. Is that how you feel about Europe, using just that as an example?
Well, Europe generally has a more, of course, there's a lot of countries in Europe and they have different perspectives on it. But in terms of, for example, in the UK, they're requiring the reporting of, your raw pay information. They have a ratio for the raw pay gap that is required to be reported. We know in, like countries like Norway and France, they have quotas on numbers on boards. So, in general, Europe has a stronger regulatory environment in many ways than the U.S. does. And of course, the U.S. is made up of states that have different perspectives.
I remember 10, 12 years ago, there was a lot of discussion, I don't like quotas, and then nothing changed. So back to kind of accountability and transparency. Jose, why don't you go ahead, and how do you think about this question?
Yeah, well, very much in line with what Lorraine was saying. I do believe that, although, the business community has been focused on DE&I for several years now, right now, there's no better time for companies to be much more transparent about their gender as well as racial data, so intersectional data. And you see a lot more, employees and consumers and investors holding these companies accountable, because many companies have put targets out there or commitments, and then there's no tracking or no accountability. But we see that changing, and part of it is because there are companies that are doing the right thing, and hopefully we'll hear more from Walmart, because they are one of those organizations that not just annually but semi-annually puts out their workforce composition in a great detail. And even if the numbers don't look great, or progress isn't fast enough for these companies, just being transparent about it builds that authenticity and trust amongst their stakeholders. And I also believe that transparency gives companies the energy to accelerate. If everyone is outcome oriented and they can engage with all their stakeholders to help improve the numbers. So I think there's so many positives about being transparent. And specifically, from the investor community, and Lorraine already mentioned this, but even last December, asset manager BlackRock became the largest player to push to get companies to disclose their gender, racial, and ethnic composition. And consumers, of course, which is an area that we play in, young people especially believe brands need to meet the challenges facing the social, face of humanity, basically on all ESGs, environment, social governance, and they will reward companies in the marketplace. A recent study that was conducted said that 44% agreed that they will support companies that have a purpose and make a positive difference in society. And also employees, as we know, that especially next-gen employees, they're very motivated and loyal to companies that take this positive action. And studies show that 59% strongly agree that the more socially companies are, the more motivated and loyal they become. But there's also another pressure out there that's the business-to-business peer pressure, I think. And as you see, with companies like Walmart and IBM and others who, even Citi, who disclosed their pay equity data, and they know they've got work to do around the median pay. I think it was at 77%. But that sets the example and leadership for the financial services industry to also disclose their pay numbers, even if it isn't 100%, pay equity. And I think that kind of peer-to-peer business pressure is maybe sometimes the biggest driver of them all, for transparency.
And just to jump around a little bit and have a conversation about this, doesn't accountability and transparency of data also tie back to intentionality, which is that word that is becoming so much more important? Even last week, I heard someone say, they are lacking, they didn't say this part, they are lacking diversity on their senior team. And somebody said, well, we're going to hire the best person for the role, which is this kind of, in my opinion, artifact comment, instead of layering the best person for the role and there's intentionality. Because this data should help push companies back to intentionality of how to effectuate that change. Jose, could you talk about that for a minute? And then Lorraine, what are your thoughts on kind of tying back to intentionality?
Yeah, and I think we've mentioned before is that, there have been good intentions, but there hasn't been a lot of follow through. And now you see that the intentions are being met with accountability, right, and transparency.
Lorraine, Catalyst is all about sort of how to help with these things. So what do you think about intentionality?
Well, I do think there's been a lot of discussion about people are talking the talk, but not walking the talk. And if you want to walk the talk, you got to start with measurement. You need to measure what matters. And as you started the conversation, if people are serious about what they're about something, they measure it. Business people measure things. Governments measure things. You've got to hold people accountable. You've got to measure it. You've also got to reward it. You've got to model the behavior. You've got to monitor it. So if you don't know what the numbers are, then you don't have a really place to start around it. You're not really seriously looking at it. So, that's why when I talk to companies, about how they, focus on moving the needle around DEI, it's got to start at the top. They've got to measure what matters. They've got to put the right policies and practices in place, and then they've got to deal with the cultural change necessary to actually accomplish it. So that measurement piece is absolutely a critical piece of what we need to be doing. Unfortunately, and we can talk about this a little later, it's complicated. It is not so simple to do it. You can't wake up and say, oh, I'll just press a button and get it. It's work to even do it. And we can talk a little bit about what's involved in that, in the conversation.
Well, why don't we go ahead and segue into Catalyst has co-founded the Gender and Diversity KPI Alliance. Why don't you tell us what that is, who you collaborated with, what does it measure, like what are the challenges? That's a good lead into us hearing more about that incredibly important program.
Yeah, thank you. Of course. So the Gender and Diversity KPI Alliance is an initiative which was put together by advocacy organizations, including the two that are sitting here with me, with the focus on how do we move the needle to get companies to start to measure what matters around DEI, and then eventually make them transparent and available. So we spent a lot of time looking at, there's lots of measurements around DEI. I mean, they're very deep. You could measure promotions, you could measure training, you could measure lots of different things. But we wanted to come up with, and the reason we call it KPIs, a couple of key metrics that really summarize things that a board of directors, investors, and top management teams can really look at to see, where are you? And then you can start to peel the onion back. So we came out with these measures, and I'll talk about them in a minute. And we've now signed up about 80 major corporations around the world who have committed to do this measurement internally. Some of them are disclosing publicly, but as you mentioned in the beginning, a limited number of them are ready to do that. But many more are understanding the need for it and starting to put the internal disciplines in place and accountability they need to drive their organizations and be accountable. So what are they? They have to do with representation and pay. So we're asking the companies to measure on gender and diversity their representation at different levels in the organization by job category. So that representation allows you to understand the original question example you hypothesized. Lots of companies are close to 50% women at the lower ranks. And it can vary on diversity. But when you get to the top of the organization, for example, on women in the Fortune 500, we're right now at 8.2%. So you have a pyramid there. And understanding that through the levels helps company understand where they have a problem. When does it start to narrow? Is it in the first line? Is it in the middle? And then you can look at that by diversity categories. So people of color in different countries, where are you? Where do you really have the issues? So that's representation. The second area is on pay equity. So again, we ask the companies to measure by job category or by actual job, comparing comparable jobs to say, where are they? So this is really important because you can, it really gets some clarity around the issues of what is this big number, like in the United States, 80% women are making 80% of men, and really peeling back that. Is it that you're not paying the same? Or is it that, the women are all in the first line, the entry level jobs, and the men are making, 400 times more as CEO? Where is the issue? Is it by category that, you have your traders making $1 million and the same person in the same job category is an events manager and they're making $100,000? Where are the issues around this? So we are, as part of this organization, help to get adoption of this and then educate people on the nuances of how do you even get representation numbers, and what is even diversity defined as in the United States versus in South Africa versus in China? They are very different. How do you even get people to disclose that piece of information so that you could actually have the data to do it? And as it relates to pay parity, what are your categories? What are you comparing? Is it equal pay for equal work, like Bank of America, which is one of our supporters in this? They're really focused on equal pay for equal work. And many of the very large companies who've really focused on it do pay the same for the same job, but they still may have an overall equity imbalance because of the pyramid issue.
So welcome, Donald. Nice to see you.
I'm so sorry.
Got on.
That's quite all right.
The laptop.
That's quite all right. It's a technology world here, but just to finish up with Lorraine, and then I'd love to have you introduce yourself, and we'll take life from there. Sure. Lorraine, you said so many amazing, important things. I love this idea of parsing the data, because there's these stories at multinational companies where they're hiring women, like they'll take a role and they'll parse it into 3 levels: level 1, level 2, level 3, and somehow the women are all level 1, but the men of comparable experience are level 3. And so there's all these kind of that's where the transparency matters, because if you have these nuances that allow companies to skirt around the actual goal here, that is a challenge that the surfacing of the data will help expose. I think that's fantastic.
Well, let me tell you, this is a very complex area, and there's still lots of opportunity to game the system with any numbers we have, as we very well know, but at least it's a big step in the right direction, and mostly so the companies can hold themselves accountable to their employees, to themselves, so they really start to understand where the issues are. So external transparency is something that's needed, but it starts with really understanding the data internally and starting to build practices that will move the needle.
That was also a great point, because companies are embarrassed. And so at least if they set it up internally and they know what they're measuring to, at some point, maybe when they're comfortable, they can come out and say, okay, we've made it this far, and here's our transparent data, and we're continuing on, but we've made this much progress. So that's a nice way to begin.
I want to tell you, in Catalyst, we have 115 people. We just really now have good representation data. I mean, and this is, because we had to get everyone to disclose, to really buy into this, so, it's, I really commend the organizations that really are doing a great job around this. It's not easy to really get these measures.
Nice. All right. Well, Donald, welcome.
Thank you.
Hopefully your ears were burning, because we're chatting about what a great job Walmart is doing. So Donald is the Senior Director of the Global Office of Culture, Diversity, and Inclusion, which is a great title. And Walmart has rapidly become a role model for other companies on this kind of, we talked earlier about business to business peer pressure. So why don't let's just dive into the second question here. Why don't you talk a little bit about Walmart and how you're defining diversity, how you helped the company become a role model in this area? Why don't you get rolling, and we'll just continue on.
Okay, cool. Hey, so sorry about the tech issues. Now I'm using my iPhone to log on to it, so the vision is a little bit limited. But anyway, to answer your question, Lane, we define diversity as the unique identity, experience, styles, abilities, and the perspectives of our workforce that reflects the communities we serve. We measure our diversity by answering 3 very simple but fundamental questions. Question number 1, do we have a workforce that reflects our customer base, measured by representation, as many companies have been doing the same way? Second, and do we offer equitable and fair opportunities for our diverse talent, measured by promotion, demotion, succession planning? And the last question is, do we have an inclusive environment that attracts and retains our diverse talent, measured by turnover, including voluntary turnover, involuntary turnover, and the new highs. Along our journey, we evolved from measuring quantitative data exclusively to measuring both quantitative and the qualitative matrix by adding culture index and it also inclusion index. That blended analysis allow us the real perceptions of our social perceptions around our environment. Additionally, each year, our inclusive leadership expectations required our 72,000 managers to mentor or sponsor at least 2 associates, participate in the DEI training, or lead DEI conversations in their own organization. Recently, with our self-identification expansion, and we are exploring ways to measure beyond the traditional EO1 categories and including gender identity, people with disabilities, and LGBTQ as our associates self-identify themselves in the system.
Let me drill down into a couple of things you said. So what an amazing list. This idea of reflecting your customer base, I think that is rolling across the industry. And in the last panel, they were talking about wealth management and investment advice for women. And since so much more money is being managed and held by women, you don't find a reflection. I think 84% of wealth advisors are still men. So you don't find that reflection of the diversity and inclusion in a professional or a business setting that mirrors the people. So I mean, how do you break that down? Do you actually go community by community, or is it kind of a generalized understanding of the community of Walmart?
It's a community by community, and
wow,
because our commitment, our CEO's the public pledge is achieving the racial equity and the gender equity, and it's not just to achieve it. At the top, at the bottom levels. It's across the levels.
Wow.
And so that's the way we measure, we track, we report on a regular basis.
You must have amazing data about the communities you serve then too.
Yeah.
And what about the other thing I love? I love qualitative data. I love measuring things in a qualitative way because people don't often give it the power that it deserves. I sometimes find qualitative measurements more powerful than quantitative because they're behavior based, or you see things shift in a very interesting way that you really have to listen to and pay attention to. So you talked about the culture index. Could you explain a culture index and what does that mean?
Yeah, we have 2 indexes from the qualitative perspective. One index is inclusion. The inclusion index truly measure our perception, our social perceptions around the sense of belonging, sense of fairness, and the sense of uniqueness. And the culture index measure the 4 core values that we promote as a corporate culture. For example, respect for the individual, drive for excellence, service our customers, and integrity. And I think those are the way the index is a measure. Does our associate really feel their supervisor, their work environment reflect that core values we uphold?
Wow. You also had to, I mean, we're talking about, you have 72,000 managers. I mean, this is turning around redirecting a massive ship. This is not a privately held company of 115 people. And Lorraine was saying it was incredibly complicated even for them.
Yeah, it is. Because, if you think about our total size of the workforce, it's 1.5 million in the United States and 2.3 million global wide. So 72,000 managers, including direct above in our home office, and it also the store manager on the store managers and the assistant manager, co-managers in the store side of it.
Wow. Jose, why don't you tell us a little bit about Gender Fair? Because really thinking about intentionality, how to drive change, accountability, what you folks have built over there is also just a best practice role model for how to think about that. So why don't you describe what you've done and maybe extrapolate a little bit on how companies might, creatively lift some of your thoughts and ideas into their own style of working.
Sure. Thank you, Lynn. So Gender Fair has been around for about 5 or 6 years, and we have been during that time doing independent research on companies as they progress towards gender parity and diversity. We base our 18 metrics on the UN Women's Empowerment Principles. So it's a very holistic view of companies, both in terms of what they project outwardly through their advertising and their community impact, but also internally, and with some of those action initiatives at the WBC being reflected in our metrics. And our metrics also really include those that we can readily access the data in the public domain. So we get this data, whether it's on leadership on the boards, including women of color on the board, women in the C-suite, any kind of leadership development programs in place. We look at employee policies and benefits. Right now it's really important to have, work-life balance, benefits and flexibility, paid family leave, of course. We look at if a company has a good sexual harassment policies in place through non-forced arbitration. And we look at the pay equity. Have they conducted a pay equity assessment? Then we look at advertising and their communications. Are there images, whether it's on their websites or in their ads, that are inclusive? Is it inclusive of different age groups and different size, body size, or different ethnic backgrounds, as well as do the ads break stereotypes in both sides of men and women? And then we give credit to companies that obviously disclose their employee workforce composition, as Walmart does so well, but also their supplier diversity. And if they track how much money is spent with minority or owned businesses or women-owned businesses. And lastly, we look at their social impact. Do they support causes that are important to women, whether it's and girls, STEM education, for example, and that's going to really advance this next generation of women. So it's very holistic. It's a 100-point scale, and any organization that has scored with 70 or higher is deemed gender fair. And then we publish it. We publish this data for consumers. We have it on our website, but also our app. And our app allows consumers to scan, any of the companies or brands, 2,500 brands. They scan the logo, and it'll tell them if that brand is gender fair. And if that brand is not gender fair, it automatically provides an alternative product. So if you're scanning a toothpaste and it's not gender fair, it'll direct the consumer to a gender fair toothpaste or cereal or soap or whatever, any of these consumer products.
You must have an extraordinary database.
We do. We update it, mainly once a year. But as companies, especially lately, we've seen a lot of increases in women's representation on the board. We will make those changes directly and automatically.
What's also interesting about your approach is it's not shame-based.
No, absolutely.
You're just being a positive reinforcement. And then that goes back to, I think it was your point earlier about peer-to-peer in the business world, kind of pressuring each other a little bit.
Right. It's just about incentives, right? And part of it is, I look back on my career, I spent 15 years in corporate America, climbing the corporate ladder. And of course, the higher you get, the fewer women. And despite all the training and development that women received, we just weren't getting the type of representation that I think, was owed to them. And part of it, they maybe blamed it on women not being able to get there. But I think, obviously there was a lot of structural issues inside organizations, and there was no real incentive, I think, on a lot of these organizations to do better. And part of, gender fair is creating the incentive for companies to do better. Because a lot of the programs were more vitamins than painkillers. And oftentimes, I think when there was a downturn in the economy, like all the leadership development would stop. And, so I think, if you can put all these pain pressures on these organizations and see it as a pain medicine rather than a vitamin, I think we're going to be accelerating a lot quicker than we have been in the past.
Nice. Feel free, by the way, folks that are watching our panel, to submit any questions, and our facilitator will roll them over to me if you have any questions. Donald, I kind of want to go back to a slightly different version of our first question, which is, I'm going to flip it around a little bit. Did you find a lot of resistance to this shift, either community by community or kind of internally or at the senior management team? Like what do you think triggered the shift in Walmart to make such a huge commitment? And if there was resistance, could you describe that, and how did you deal with it?
Yeah, Walmart started the DEI journey 16 years ago. So
wow, it's a long time ago.
Yeah, we have evolved from a compliance-based program to a strategic driving force for business growth, social justice, and social engagement. And let me share two barrier examples. Now, in the early days, we had limited engagement from top down, bottom up. We thought DI was the exclusive responsibility for Chief Diversity Officer or the Office of Diversity. And we used to communicate and our narrative and have conversations only with a woman, people of color, people with disabilities, LGBTQ+, and other underrepresented the groups, and ignore the white male and the middle level management. And keep in mind that more than 70% of them are decision makers, and we simply cannot afford to have them as a bystander, right? And later along the journey, and we adopted some levers, or as you mentioned, enablers to course correct and the targeting for lasting results. For example, leading by example. And our CEO pledged publicly for achieving gender parity and racial parity, and holds our EC members accountable in sustaining the progress. Today, 40% of his direct reports are women.
Mm.
And another area is governance, and our board places DEI as a gender items all the time, reviewing status and discussing existing challenge and exploring strategy regularly. Today, 27% of our board directors are women. And then the last the level will be broader engagement. And we shift our vision to everyone included. It's simple, straightforward. Invite middle-level management and white males to become an ally or advocate. And the battle that the resistance from the frozen middle, and help our people understand this is everyone's business, right? Not a zero-sum game.
Nice. Lorraine, what do you see at Catalyst around that idea? I mean, Jose mentioned that, part of what you measure is also stereotypes about men. which are obviously equally unfair and a huge part of the issue. But so what are you seeing as far as what triggers the mostly men in power to make this kind of commitment? What do you see as sort of happening that, and what will help women and men in their organization if they want to go to the CEO and say, we need to make this shift? Like, what do you see are those triggers that sort of the light bulb goes off then?
Well, first of all, I think through the pandemic and coming out of the pandemic, we're seeing much more intentionality and actually walking the talk around this than we've seen previously. Now, people on the Catalyst board or Catalyst supporters, are a bit of a skewed population because they're already committed to some extent, but the level of commitment and intentionality has really accelerated. And why is that? First of all, I do think that because of the pandemic, which laid bare a lot of the inequities in our society, whether it's by race or gender, both of them, has really heightened people's awareness from a fairness standpoint, but also from an understanding of how interconnected we all really are. And companies like Walmart or Procter & Gamble, who service very broad populations, understand that, we are all in it together. We can't be, everyone's got to be successful together, and we've got to bring everyone along. We also, understand, and as Donald said, the population, the decision makers need to reflect the consumer, because that's how you're going to get the best decisions, and that is reflected in the numbers, and that information has become common knowledge. But also, because we are now in a war for talent, people really understand we can't overlook major parts of the population. I mean, let's just take the Asian community. In the Asian community are generally better educated than any other minority sector in the United States and over the world, have higher level, entry level salaries. But when you get down to the top, it's like 3%. That has to stop. We are overlooking talent that is there that needs to come up through the ranks. So companies who are going to be successful are going to lean into this because they're going to get the right talent. So this intentionality is there. So what is the difficult thing is the cultural change, because many, no one thinks that they're biased until they realize that everyone is biased. We all have biases. So what our MARC program, Men Advocating Real Change, which is an allyship program focused on mostly white men, because those are mostly who's in power right now, to help them understand their biases and help them become allies to making these changes. And most people believe in the fairness, they understand the business case for it, but we've really got to overcome the institutional biases that are continuing to perpetuate. And that's what some of the workshops and courses that we have. And also, as Donald mentioned, they have an inclusion measurement tool. We also have one called the Catalyst Inclusion Accelerator, that it measures inclusion down at the departmental level, because 45% of creating an inclusive workplace is really at the first line manager. Those are the people that really set the work environment.
I think also to the pandemic, the amount of arguing and kind of absurd circular conversations for the last 10, 15 years around remote work was pretty absurd. And all of a sudden, overnight, we all did it. And it worked, essentially. I mean, of course, there were all these challenges and fallback, but that also speaks to the idea of human capital and talent. And you can get talent from so many different places these days. And, fly them in once in a while. That's fine. It's not expensive. So it's,
well, I want to talk to that. I really think we have an opportunity to make a change in the nature of work for the better, for equity for everyone, greater than any time since the Industrial Revolution. We've all been in a very large experiment, and those of us who've been advocates for women because of work-life balance, to have flexible and remote, we now know that it can work. And our research shows that people are more productive, they have less burnout, they're more innovative, and they have more intention to stay. So that is why many, many executives are looking at how they can do this well. But the secret sauce to doing this well is to have inclusive leadership, because those leaders need to understand and have empathy and more understanding and hold people accountable, give them autonomy, allow them to have flexibility. That takes a different type of leadership style. And that really is inclusive leadership models that we've all been talking about.
I so agree with you. And there's this kind of myth going around at the CEO level of innovation, and innovation happens at the water cooler, and so many companies last year were very innovative. It's back to intentionality. If you can increase your communication touch points in a remote environment, I found zero deficit to innovation, frankly. So great. So thank you. Boy, we've got about 4 minutes left. I don't think any questions came across the transom, but let's go to our last question. If you could suggest sort of 1 to 2 ways to accelerate progress here around accountability, around transparency, what would those 1 to 2 ways be? And Jose, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I think one of the ways is just to get over the fear of transparency. And I think that's holding a lot of companies back, even if there is a positive correlation with those companies that are transparent and their return on investment. So I think just to get over that first hurdle of fear, because the numbers may not look good, but for the most part, they don't look good for most organizations. There's very few organizations that have reached, pay parity or gender parity or, anything like that. So I think first is just get over the fear and just put out the numbers, and if they don't look good, just say we're going to do better, and put those targets out there. And again, if you don't meet the targets, because this is hard work, right? It may not be difficult to put a woman of color on the board as much as to, develop women internally to the C-suite, or in a short period of time. I still think that, as long as if you're authentic and you've got that trust with your stakeholders, they have a lot of grace, if you don't meet the targets. There's a lot of grace there, as long as you are honest and transparent. And I think companies just have to get over that first hurdle of fear.
That's a great word, grace. Nice. Lorraine, what would you suggest are sort of 1 to 2 things to accelerate progress here?
Well, I'd like to suggest that you consider joining the Gender and Diversity KPI Alliance. You can go to www.gdka.org and sign the pledge, and then start measuring what matters, which is representation and pay equity in your organization. And we can help you by being part of a community that's on a learning journey, learning from each other. We have a lot of knowledge and information around that, and also companies that are really further on their journey. And you don't have to start by disclosing. You can start by being accountable within your organization.
Yeah, that internal idea we talked about earlier. Yep. And Donald, what do you think? 1 to 2 ways, with your many years of vast experience turning the ship around, as we talked about. What's 1 to 2 things you think should be focused on that could accelerate progress here?
I would say target high. And,
what was that again? Target hard?
Target high. Right?
High. Okay.
High. We target our goals after best of the best, and not only just the end goals, but also near-term, mid-term, and the long-term goals. The second piece will be accountability is critical, and leverage all checkpoints to review and sustain progress all the times. And the last one is ensure the matrix we adopt are game changer, are actionable, and also informing behavior change.
Wow. Target high, that's great, because so many companies say by 2030 we want to do blah blah, instead of why don't you just set what is the ultimate goal first. Nice. And then I'd like the near, the mid, and the long term milestones. I think milestones are hugely important and underappreciated, because you can also celebrate milestones and it inspires people along the way. Back to my original story of a CEO that set up a business plan and then didn't tell anybody how it was going. That does not inspire people. You want to be inspired and engaged as you're making progress. Great. Well, thank you all. This was a great conversation. I hope our audience found it productive, helpful, and actionable. I'm sure you're all available to help if anyone has specific questions. It was amazing to be on this panel with 3 world-class experts on this incredibly important topic, because we don't want to spend the next 20 years staying around 7-8% of whatever metric we're trying to measure here. It's just stalled for too long. Hence WBC's core mission to accelerate progress. That's what we've come together to do here. So thank you again, and thank you to Kathleen for moderating us and on the back end here and all the help. And great, have a wonderful day. I'm going to have visions of accountability in my head all day now.
Thank you so much, Lynn.
Take it.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.